Hi there, I'm Speedy, and as you might have guessed from my name, the title, or whatever I have going on in the background right now, I really like run cycles. My first animation ever was a run cycle, and from making quite literally dozens of them, they've become the comfort zone of comfort zones for me. I should mention, I'm talking about cat run cycles specifically. I've animated exactly one human running before, which was pretty fun, but I'm not confident there. For making so many, you'd probably expect that I have a pretty solid process for making one, right? Well, yes and no. I want to be upfront and say that while I am confident in my ability to make a run cycle, I am very much an experimenter and feeler-outer when it comes to animation. I deviate from my own process quite a bit and am self-taught, so keep that in mind. I'll be sharing advice, mainly that I would have found very valuable to hear while making run cycles initially. Additionally, for this tutorial, I'll be using ToonBoom Harmony Advanced Essentials. Due to this, my setup advice, as well as other parts of this tutorial, will be mostly geared towards ToonBoom, but other people should be able to use it for general advice as well. Okay, for setting up in ToonBoom, you create a new scene either through the prompt when you first open the app or going to File, New if you already have a different scene open. You're automatically given one layer called Drawing, which you can rename however you like. I usually rename this layer to Refs and then recolor in the timeline to black by double-clicking on the layer. I then paste in all my references and move them to the outside of my camera view. I like to be able to see all my refs all the time. So I've actually shoved my drawing view into the top right corner here and turned on my light table with 100% opacity so I can see my boy at all times. You can create other regular drawing layers by clicking on the plus icon, then selecting drawing, and you can make a bunch of layers from this or just one. Also important to add right off the bat is a color card. This is a different layer mode you can also find by clicking the plus. It basically just gives you a background color that you can set to be anything by double clicking on it and tapping the white rectangle to get a color selection prompt. If you don't have a color card, your background is seen as transparent and things like .movs will be exported with a black background by default. So you get something like this. Now, some useful keybinds to know while sketching are F9, which creates a new frame, F5, which extends the last frame to an empty cell you have selected in the timeline, Alt/, the pencil tool, Alt-E, the erase tool, Alt-B, the brush tool, hold down Control, gives you the lasso/transform tool, G moves you to the next frame, and F moves you to the previous frame. Also, watch out for Alt-M. It morphs the drawing, which just kind of scrunches things up. I don't use it and kept accidentally hitting it while trying to go to the pencil tool, so I have the keybind actually disabled for myself. You can customize other keybinds pretty easily as well. I've set minus to be zoom out and equal sign to be zoom in. Another oddly specific warning. If you're copy pasting from frame to frame, do not copy a frame from the timeline unless your intention is to clone the frame. Copy pasting the timeline clones cells, so whatever you do to one version of that frame, it'll happen to another pasted or copied version of it. If you don't want to clone what you've drawn, select it from the actual camera or drawing view and paste it into a new, non-cloned frame. You can also copy a frame, then turn it into a duplicate with this button, but that will take a little bit longer. Now, for actually setting up the timeline, there are two main things to do. For my initial sketch layer, I like to have at least the first frame copy-pasted from the timeline at the end, so I can see it whenever I turn on the onion skin on the last frame. I tend to do more than that, however, and have a whole cycle repeated about 2 or 3 times in my timeline before I cut it off by dragging this black indicator above the first frame to be cut off. Importantly, if you want your cycle to loop when you hit the play button, you have to hit this arrow. Well, without further delay, let's start the sketch. I'll be using the pencil tool for my sketch and lines. And pause, actually. Since this goes by so fast, there's one crucial step here I want to point out that I wish I'd used before when I was just starting out with run cycles. This rectangle on the floor. This rectangle is very important for me as I'm going to be lining up the character's feet with it. This is something I do for casual profile cycles like this, but if I'm going to be doing something like a scene, it's usually unnecessary. Before I did this, I had a huge problem with my feet popping in and out of place and making things feel odd. This was mainly in walking cycles, but it's a good tool for running as well. Okay, resume. Here we can see I started sketching the one element of the character that will not be changing throughout the cycle, the face. Certain elements of the face may change, but generally it's fine if the eye, eyebrow, muzzle, and any structural elements of the face stay the same. I also use a circle to outline where the rest of the head will be and sketch out how to line up, but I'm not going to be keeping any additional elements like the ear or fur quite yet since they will be changing throughout the rest of the frames. Moving on, I use the head as a starting point for what I'm going to be using as the initial pose, the most condensed version of our character. In my case, the character who's being used for this run cycle is named Ren. Sliding in a little bit of self-promo for him, He's actually a character owned by both me and my friend Tim, and is the protagonist of a comic that we've been working on pre-production for. The comic is called Tunnelers, and will be an apocalypse-based story focused on Ren and his fellow survivors. We're still a ways away from pages being released, but the comic already has social media accounts if you would like to follow those to see updates and stuff. I'll probably bother everyone here about it again when the prologue drops. Those will be linked below. Okay, bye! Continuing on, I've roughed out the most condensed part of the cycle. You may notice he's bald, but he won't be forever. I tend to do undetailed roughs first, then add in things like fur on other layers in different colors. Anyways, this is the base pose I usually start out with because I find it easiest to figure out how the legs will move from this point. One of the most important things that I've learned from doing run cycles myself is that I don't enjoy the look or feel of a cycle if the legs move completely in sync. I enjoy the more natural, semi-chaotic looks of the legs being slightly out of sync with one another, though they're still doing the same motion. You'll notice a lot of animators do this with the forelegs, but not the hind legs. This will not always be what you want from a run cycle, but it's the kind of cycle I'm demonstrating. For the sake of clarity as well, I have designated one of the front and back legs to be the leading leg. This leg will be the one who gets to the peak of their arc first and directs the other fore or back leg to follow. For this cycle, the front leg closest to us is the leading foreleg, while the back leg furthest from us is the leading back leg. Each of these is about a frame ahead of the other leg from the pair, maybe a bit less. Next, I sketch out what's going to be the frame where the leading foreleg reaches the highest part of its motion. These two frames will be useful for basing the rest of the frames on. For this run cycle, I decided to work with 6 different frames running at 8 FPS. In ToonBoom, I simply use 24 FPS and make a new drawing every 3 frames, or work on 3s if you're more familiar with that terminology. It's not going to be particularly smooth, but it'll get the cycle down. Here's what the 6 final frames will look like. Here, we have the squashed frame we start out with as a base, and here, we have the stretching frame we just drew. In between are several frames which I will start finding a placement for using the head I sketched out before. I do this by copy-pasting the head into each of the newly added frames and moving them around. I'll be using my fun little control shortcut for this. For the motion of the head, you want to make sure it's moving in an elliptical pattern. In my example, we have 4 extreme points in the frames. The squish frame has the furthest back point of the head, the initial stretch frame I drew has the highest point, then as I move the head around, I also create the furthest forward point and the lowest down point on 2 different frames. The remaining 2 are transition points between the high and low points of the cycle. As the head moves also, I like to make it rotate. The forehead leads during the forwards motion and the nose drags during the backwards motion, the head slowly tilting up and down over time as it traces the loop. After marking out where the head goes, I move on to sketch out where the rest of the body is bit by bit, starting with the body bean and my leading foreleg. For Ren, I make sure to have his feet constantly being pulled back at the toes to where they were in the last frame. This gives them a feeling of weight. His case is a bit exaggerated because he in fact has massive stompers, but this can be fun to play with in any character. As this plays out, I'll give advice on what the motion will be like for a foreleg. In my cycles, the forelegs spend most of the time in the air and have 4 main stages. There are the exaggerated frames. First, where the foreleg is shooting back below the body, I usually portray the foot here as off the ground, but it could be on the ground still. Second, where the foreleg is at its peak in the air. Then there are the transitory frames. First, the longer transition of the foreleg coming back down to the ground, then going along the ground to the below body exaggeration frame. In this phase, there's 1 frame in the air and 2 frames moving along the ground at a consistent pace. Second, there's the much quicker transition of the foreleg coming from below the body to moving ahead. In this cycle, this is just 1 frame where Ren's leg is divided into his forearm that's leading him forwards and his paw that is still pointing backwards, being dragged by the rest of the motion rather than leading it. Now, for the back legs, there's a key motion of the hips. You'll notice that for the most squashed frame, the spine is bunched up with the hips and back legs all being very forwards. Then in the most stretched frame, the spine is almost a flat diagonal board as the hips are pushed back by the motion of the legs. All the other frames will be consistently transitioning between these 2 points, trying to make this motion as smooth as possible. I find the motion of the back legs to be much simpler than the forelegs, but actually much harder to pull off right. Perhaps for this exact reason. I mainly divide the frames into 2 distinct moments. Half of the frames are the push, where the back leg is right above the ground in its exaggerated squash pose, then the frames where the back leg push along the ground to feed the motion. The other half are the airtime frames. Two of these are simple, exaggerated drawings of the back legs slowly moving in the air in their little circle, and one is returning back to the body to feed the push. The time of go to the legs can obviously vary depending on what kind of feel you want for the cycle. If you want to create more desperation, for example, you may speed up the back legs, increase the push's amount of frames, and decrease the lag time between them. If you want a more lighthearted, free feel, you could decrease the emphasis on the push and increase airtime. The forelegs just kind of bend to the will of the back legs either way, I find. No matter what you do though, always make sure to keep playing your animation back or refer to the frames around the one you're working on. Now, before moving on to details, we're going to sketch out the basic motion of the tail. The tail can do pretty much whatever, but it has two general rules. 1. It follows the motion of the body, it doesn't lead it or move with it. 2. It bunches up like the spine does and snaps to follow the spine when the push propels the subject forwards. How much it bunches or snaps, though, can change depending on the cycle. I mainly just feel the tail out for individual animations. I found that I don't like the bunching up to be all that exaggerated, but it certainly can work. As I'm sketching out these add-ons, like the tail, I'll be making sure to make new layers to reflect these so that I don't just draw on the same Ren layer. I'll be recoloring all of these layers as I make them so that they reflect the color I'll be using to draw most of the add-ons for that layer. The actual things sketched out on each layer don't have much to do with each other, they're just far enough away from one another to physically not interfere with one another. I'll actually be using 2 colors per layer also, just to save space for myself on the timeline. One of these colors will be on the line art color layer, and the other one will be on the color layer. You can switch back and forth on these by pressing L or by clicking on each of them here. Do note that your ref may disappear on your drawing view when you go to the color layer since you probably put it on the line one. You can easily just copy paste it into the color layer and it'll show back up. For this section, there's not much specific advice I have, just figure out what details will be on each layer, then have each of them follow the motion of the cycle. The most important thing to note would be that as details decrease in size and are weight, they are less prone to being dragged along by the motion. Everything should be at least somewhat affected by the motion at its tip though. When it comes to doing these details, you can pretty easily copy-paste things from frame to frame and transform them as you please. I usually do this with just fur connected to the head, some random bits I want to keep consistent, and the ears, then freehand everything else. You could probably copy-paste quite a few more things as well, however. So long as things get transformed, they shouldn't appear stagnant. Anything you do decide to copy-paste can also benefit from being redrawn or altered by hand on certain frames. Don't feel like you're stuck doing one or the other. And congrats to all of us, we did the sketch! Yay! That was probably the most brain power needing section. But unfortunately now we have the most time consuming section. Lining. Also, moving on, there will be a lot more focus on specifically ToonBoom assets. Now, for lining, I'm again going to be using the pencil tool. But this time, that's especially important because it's very cool. If you press K, you'll see a bunch of blue lines show up. You can press K again to make them go away. As a note, you'll only be able to see the blue lines for strokes on the color layer you currently have selected. When you draw with the brush tool, the whole stroke is surrounded by a blue contour. However, when drawing with the pencil, there's only a singular line that goes right down the middle of your stroke, not around it. Why is this important? Well, that's because it gives the pencil brush the very nice pro of not getting any thicker or thinner when you transform it. The blue stroke is what's being transformed, not the entire line after all. The pencil tool is also nice because you can add texture to it, and this will not make it any less difficult for the program to fill it in with the bucket tool. Something that's not true for the brush tool. It does have some mild downsides though, as compared to the brush tool. If you use the cutter tool to delete intersecting lines made by the brush tool, it'll make a very nice sharp edge. However, if you do the same technique with the pencil, it'll make some fairly ugly indents at the edge. You can remedy this pretty easily though, by simply cutting one of the lines, then manually looping around part of the other with the cutter, and then deleting that to make a nice edge. Now, the helpful shortcuts for lining are as follows. Alt/, the pencil tool, Alt-T, the cutter tool, Alt-E, the eraser tool, which I actually don't recommend for lining with the pencil tool. Alt-Y, fill unfilled area bucket tool. Alt-C, close gap with invisible line tool. Alt-V, draw invisible line tool. The invisible line tools I just mentioned are very fun and cool. I usually only use them for lining if I need to fill in something with black, like the lips, and I haven't properly enclosed the area for that. You can only see them when you press K, and they will create more blue lines like the pencil and brush tool do. They also act like the pencil tool does, but only having one line in the middle of the stroke. Just as a warning though, if you're gonna use them, be careful if you have a computer that might crash. I've had far too many files instantly delete themselves because I didn't press K before trying to draw an invisible line. For me, it's usually this pop-up though that causes the crash. So if you don't crash and then you tell it not to tell you this again, it won't risk crashing until the next time you boot up Harmony. And for doing the lines, there's only really 3 things to do. First, make a palette where you can make a color for your line art, then select a tool and texture it, and then get lining. The only thing I copy-paste for this section will be the head, so unfortunately that means everything else will be done individually by hand for each frame. Pain. For my tool, I've chosen the fixed thickness pencil, and I'm using grain as my texture. Usually I'll be using size 3, but I've also got a separate bunch of lines at size 1 I'll be using to lay out markings. The color I use for this looks like the same black at first, but it's actually a completely different color. I do also switch it to a bright red later just to make this more clear. This is also the first time I've done this for markings. Usually I just use the invisible line tool to draw in markings. The reason I'm not doing this at this time is because I want to make 2 different versions of this run cycle, one of which being specifically in the style of the comic that Ren will be in, which has markings that are outlined by thin lines. Well, now the only thing to do is just get it done. Alrighty, now that the lines are done, we move on to coloring. Since I drew all the markings already, coloring should go pretty fast. The main thing that would hinder this stage are gaps between the lines. Some of these can only be found by pressing K, since sometimes pencil lines that appear closed are actually not touching according to the blue strokes. For this, you'll want to use one of our shortcuts for this section. Our new shortcuts are Alt-C, close gap with invisible line, Alt-V, draw invisible line, Alt-Y, fill unfilled area, and Alt-X, the stencil brush. Only one of these is new actually. The stencil brush is a very fun one, which we'll be using to recolor the lines. Usually I'd use the stencil brush to just recolor the bottom of the eye, or maybe if I'm feeling bold, I'll recolor more body lines. But today I'm mainly going to be using it to recolor the marking lines so they don't show up on Ren's normal colored version. For this, I'm making a whole new palette where I copy several of the colors these marking lines helped solidify. I then go into Ren's normal palette and select every single color except his marking lines color. Right click, then select Protect Color. This will make it so that the stencil brush can only recolor the marking lines. I'll also be making sure that the regular line color is unprotected so I can recolor the bottom of the iris. Now, we just have to finish up the recoloring and Ren's basic color version will be done. Now that that version of Ren is done, you'll also notice I have another version of him waiting at the side here. A grayscaled version. This is because these are his comic colors. Now, if you've used ToonBoom before, you know that if you want to alter a color a character has, it's pretty easy. Just select that color from the palette and change it. This will change that color everywhere it has been used in your scene. However, that's not what we'll be doing really. I don't want to alter my actual palette. That would mean I'd only get to see one of my versions of this file at a time, and it'd be pretty annoying having to swap every single color back and forth. Instead, we'll be using a nice ToonBoom feature, a color override layer. You can find this layer type by clicking the plus button again, then going to Effects in the drop-down menu. Color Override should be one of the many effects layers to pop up. I can apply it to Ren by selecting Ren's layer in the timeline, then adding the effect layer. This will make it appear as a sub-layer. Using Color Override, I can tell ToonBoom to alter my palettes to match my comic version. It will do this very nicely, then quickly revert to the original version if I hide the effect layer. Now we're almost done. We've successfully made the run cycle and colored it. But I want to shade it too. We won't do anything that intense, just some nice comic shading. For this I'll need a couple of things. First, I want to clone my Ren layer by clicking on it and selecting Clone Selected Layer, Drawings and Timing. I'll rename it Matte, and then lock this layer so I can easily identify it. Second, I want to add a new drawing layer and call it Shade. I'll color it in black in the timeline as well. Third, I want to apply the layer effect Cutter to my shading layer. Like with Color Override, I will select the layer, click the plus button, and then find it under Effects. Once I have my cutter layer, I want to go to Layer Properties and check the box next to Inverted. Last but not least, for this cutter layer, I'll need to hit its little plus button, then go over and select the layer I named Matte, and then drag and drop it into the empty box next to Matte. Once I do this, I can make new frames matching my Ren frames, and once I draw in them, I'll find that I'm confined to drawing with the boundaries of his body. Now, we shade! Alrighty, now that the black shading is done, let's also test out one last thing. For the color version, let's add some blue shading with a multiply filter. Let's clone the shading layer and use another color override layer to turn the shading blue. We've cloned it so that we can have the opacity be different and not bother the black shading's opacity. No other reason. Now, let's do two more things. First, let's lower the blue shading's opacity, something around 40 should be nice. Second, let's add yet another effect layer to the shading. This one is called Blending. This basically gives you the same drop-down menu you get in pretty much any art program for layer filters when you select your blending layer and go to Layer Properties. Here, we'll choose Multiply. You'll notice this doesn't really seem to do anything in the normal view, and that's because we're in our default OpenGL view. ToonBoom doesn't render things like blending layers here. We have to click on Render View first to be able to see what our fancy blue will look like. A lot of the time I'll also add an effect called Blur Gaussian, which only does something if you input a value in Layer Properties, but I didn't add anything like that for this animation. And now, we've done it! All we have to do now is export it. I set my color card to a nice color for each of my cycles and export them as GIFs. I also like to turn off my color card completely, then export my individual frames as transparent images. ToonBoom doesn't let you export transparent GIFs unfortunately, but free sites like my favorite EasyGIF will let you do this with ease. And that's all. I hope this tutorial was helpful to someone looking to make a run cycle. If you use this tutorial and want to show off what you make, feel free to tag me on YouTube, Instagram, or any other social media I've got in my link tree. Even if I'm not active, I'll get a notification. If you're someone who might learn from this better by direct observation also, I do have this fun little template I made for this run cycle you can feel free to reference. If you want to trace it for learning purposes also, I'm fine with that, but please credit me for the base if that's what you choose to do. Don't just pass it off as your own and be done with it. Let me know if you guys also would like me to do a tutorial on anything else. I was considering making a looping, parallaxing background again for this, but then I got lazy. I'd be happy to make that as a sequel though if that sounds like fun. And one last minute self-promotion, I have opened commissions with a new pricing sheet and everything that looks very fancy. If you're interested in one of those, you can message me through Discord or Instagram. If you want to commission me through Discord, the best way you can probably do that is by going and joining my Discord server down in the description below. That'll let you just message me right from the server. You can also try to send me a friend request. I'll have my user linked in the description below, and also on my commission sheet. But try to send me a message that gives some sort of preface as to why you're friending me, otherwise I may not friend you back. Anyways, thanks for watching if you made it this far. I'm Speedy, and I'm going back into the abyss. Bye!